Hi everyone, I'm degentradergirl and I'm here with Suda.
Hello.
We just had a phenomenal discussion with David, Hal, and John about Gen 2 brains, genome mining, ASTO, and the Discovery Auction.
Yeah, absolutely. And this conversation's jam-packed with alpha, so you want to stick around for the whole thing, guys.
Yeah, there's a lot of alpha in this conversation. I'm really excited to share it out to the community. The questions you're going to hear us ask in this conversation were all community driven from Discord and other social channels. And we're really excited to have a new way that we can get community questions to the founders and leaders of Altered State Machine.
Our community is one of our biggest driving forces, and we want to make sure that they're getting the answers that they deserve. And this conversation is, well, you're going to get some answers.
Yeah, definitely a lot of answers in this conversation, a lot of alpha here. So without further ado, let's jump into our first question for David. A common question is the differences and similarities between Genesis and Gen 2 brains. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, great question. So this is something we'd put a lot of thought into the design of how the economy of Altered State Machine is going to work, how we're going to service use cases that are in the pipeline, and how people are going to participate in the protocol at different levels. So as everybody knows, we are big fans of our early supporters. Those guys have been with us from the beginning and have put their effort into understanding what we're building, giving us feedback on everything, and being part of building this protocol together. So we're extremely incentivized to reward those people on an ongoing basis. And how we do that is through the Genesis assets. Being able to reward those participants long-term is important. But on the other side, we don't want there to be a massive barrier to entry for mass market adoption. That would mean the protocol doesn't succeed in the way that it's designed to. So we have to really have these different classes of assets that allow participation, but also reward those who have put their time and effort into building the protocol with us. And the way that we do that is by making Genesis assets the seed assets for the ecosystem. So we've demonstrated that through the ASTO airdrop claim, which allows those Genesis brain holders to participate in the LBA to set the price for the ASTO token and get a decent portion of those LBA rewards out of the process, and also produce Gen 2 brains, the sort of entry-level assets into the market through the genome mining mechanic, and reap the rewards from doing so. And those Gen 2 brains that come into the market, they'll participate in the use cases in a fair and equitable way so that it doesn't become a pay-to-win platform, but they won't have access to the same reward systems as the Genesis assets do. And one of those reward systems that the Genesis assets have is the hereditary AI, which allows Genesis brains to create derivatives of those brains that contain the genetic memories of AI training that those brains participate in, which allows those people to sell premium pre-trained assets into the marketplace for various use cases and be really the suppliers or the seed assets for all the use cases that are coming out for the Altered State Machine platform. So that'll provide sort of ongoing yield to Genesis asset holders going forward.
Genesis brains are our seed assets. And in terms of the protocol and participation in our protocol, Genesis brains and Gen 2 brains are completely different. The participation in our protocol for Genesis brain holders includes things like early access and advantage in certain events, and an ability to impact the protocol as we stand it up over the next little while. Within the scope of game, there is no difference between a Genesis brain and a Gen 2 brain. There's no advantage, there's no higher value within the genome matrix. They are the same functionally within the game.
Can you speak to why that was important for you and the team to make it so that the Genesis brains did not have an advantage in gameplay?
The environment of AFA, for example, is such that you have a supply of brains provided through Gen 2 to accommodate a large number of gamers, and we will be releasing more Gen 2 brains onto the market to maintain accessibility of AFA for people who want to play it. And having 10,000 brains that have an advantage within the game doesn't make sense and knocks the modeling. And so in terms of the functionality within game, Genesis brains don't have any advantage.
The Genesis collection has 10,000 brains to it. Are you comfortable talking about the short and long-term supply that you see for Gen 2 brains and the differences in scarcity between the two?
Yeah, so one of the functions of the DAO is to manage that supply and demand of brains entering the market according to what use cases are available to consume those brains, and users on the platform are available to purchase and use those brains. The demand is going to obviously increase over time and also increase in chunks as new use cases are onboarded into the Ultra-State Machine protocol. I mean, I could throw out any number from, hundreds of thousands to millions right now, and at some point we expect that to be the case as the protocol grows out and as more use cases come on board. But as long as we keep that barrier for entry low, but also the reward for people who are participating at a higher level, like being early contributors and like being early people in the ecosystem, as long as we keep those two factors in balance, then that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to do.
That makes sense. So Gen 2 brains will have a low price point for entry by design.
So these things will be set by the market, but they need to be pretty accessible for mass market adoption. And the owners of those assets who are just getting into the ecosystem or just jumping into a game will have the ability to participate in those use cases and train up those assets to a level where they are more valuable because they're either winning soccer games or producing awesome music or creating wicked art or having interesting conversations with people or whatever the things that you're training them for, or a combination of all those things, including, winning car racing games. All those use cases will increase the value of those brains over time so that they are not actually locked out of participating at a high level through putting effort into grinding those things. The idea is to make it as fair as possible, make sure there's a path to participating at the same level as everybody else and reward those who have been with us in the beginning. And we think it's a pretty good system for doing that.
As the community starts to create a mental model for how they're thinking about Gen 2 brains, can you speak a little bit more about supply and the differences in the Genesis collection and the Gen 2 or any other collections after the Genesis collection?
Essentially, we very purposefully modeled the Genesis 2 brain mining, what we refer to as genome mining process, so that we could maintain control over the supply of Genesis 2 brains into the market, primarily so that we can make sure that there are enough for all of the game titles that we have coming onto the roadmap. Additionally, to make sure that we can maintain a price for what you might call an empty brain that allows you to go and start playing, that is not prohibitive or elitist. What I think people really need to take some time to understand is that the value of a brain is only realized fully when you train the brain. And so the actual genome matrix within a brain is a representation of the potential of that brain. Only when you go and realize that potential through training is the value of that brain, in fact, realized? And so empty Gen 2 brains on the market in the context of no game should be cheap, accessible, and there should be enough for people to be able to pick them up and do what they want to do with them. And we need to control that supply. The market for AFA strikers, for example, is a very different market. These are brains that have been picked up and trained in the context of AFA. And so those will be bundled, perhaps with a form and with the performance statistics of that brain, and sold as a AFA player in the context of AFA the game. Now that brain now has the full realized value of what was just potential when it was sitting in the Gen 2 market. The Gen 2 market will have brains that are low potential within AFA and high potential within AFA. And so there will be a curve there in terms of what the potential value of a Gen 2 brain is within AFA. But it is still just an empty brain. And within the context of another game that's coming up shortly, it may have a completely different level of potential.
Do you expect Gen 2 brains to be inherently rare?
Some, and only within the context of a particular game or execution environment. So once the ability mappings for AFA are released, we'll all be able to see what the potential of all brains are within the context of AFA.
So it seems that there's a potential for Gen 2 brains to be rare, but do we expect Gen 2 brains to be scarce?
No. So if you're looking at the Genesis 2 brain collection as a way to farm a scarce asset for profit, you're probably looking at it in the wrong way. But what we will have is the scarcity of high potential brains within the context of particular games. So let's use AFA as the concrete example. There will be maybe, and these numbers are completely contrived examples, but there may only be 100 brains across the whole Genesis 2 collection that have a value in power and speed higher than an 8. And so those are scarce in the context of AFA. And that number 8 does not mean that brain will go and act at that level within AFA. It means that brain has the ability to learn how to act within those constraints, and that the ceiling for speed and power is high.
We're anticipating that certain brains are going to be extremely coveted and extremely rare because of their particular attributes. So you could imagine, for example, that one particular brain, just because of the way its genome operates, is specifically good at, say, speed or attack during the AFA game. And in that scenario, you can certainly imagine how certain genomes could become highly coveted. So the way we're thinking about this is that the floor of genomes, or the entry price for genomes, will be relatively accessible to a large number of people, and yet those very rare, very special genomes will still be highly prized and highly valued.
So some of this will be controlled by the DAO in the future, of course. That's a good caveat to say. But are there numbers that we can start to put around the Gen 2 collection in terms of how many we expect we're going to need in the coming months and years? It sounds like in a world where one day hundreds of thousands or millions of people want to play games and participate in other execution environments, there could be hundreds of thousands or even millions of non-Genesis brains.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm comfortable talking about billions of people playing our games. And we would need, if we went to that order of magnitude, we would need to, of course, increase the pool, because otherwise what you get is an elitist group of people who have access to these games, and it would require a prohibitive amount of capital to be able to participate. And we see this in AXI scholarships. You have people who don't have access to that level of capital being leveraged because they simply have no other way into the ecosystem. We don't want that. We want anybody to be able to come and pit their wits against anybody else and train and apply their strategy to train the best team they can and be able to enjoy competing and play the game. This is our ethos.
That's wonderful, and that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like the supply of Gen 2 brains will depend on the number of people who want to play those games or participate in those various execution environments.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you want to include?
There's an event where we discover the ability mapping for AFA for the genome matrix.
So every brain will be interpreted differently by every single execution environment.
That's right. That's right.
In theory, it's possible you could have a brain that's the best player in AFA that's actually quite a poor performer in another game.
That's exactly right. So every execution environment, every game is going to interpret the genomes in different ways. So just as any skill in life, you might be someone who's very good at music, but say very poor at writing poetry, or whatever the game or whatever the skill is.
So John, could you tell us a little bit more about genome mapping? That was a term that Hal used.
So as you'll notice, each genome is actually unique. So just visually, you'll see that there are different peaks and different troughs within each of the brains that you already own. And indeed, eventually, we're going to be revealing what we're calling the AFA genome mapping. And this will essentially show which parts of the genome correspond to different traits within the AFA game. And in particular, some genomes are going to be high for certain attributes and maybe lower for others. And what this means is that within the very specific context of AFA, certain genomes are going to be better at certain behaviors than others. Now, you can imagine that for other games as well, the genome mappings will be different. So you could, for example, have a brain that ends up being relatively poor at the different AFA attributes, but could end up being, very, very good at other games down the line. And another thing to recognize is we talk a lot about different games and different scenarios. And certain games are going to put more of a preference on training, whereas other games are going to put more of a preference on the innate attributes of a genome. So it could be that a certain game really depends on the training that's applied to the game, whereas in another game, people really benefit from the innate attributes of the genomes.
Another community question about the genome matrix is about the numbers. Does a high number always equate to being better?
Not necessarily, because the genome matrix is a map of personality traits or gene traits that give constraints to a character within any given world or a brain within any given use case. Those can be expressed in a lot of different ways. So that the goal around the genome matrix is that it creates both consistency and flexibility in the way people can deploy AI within their environments. And we can't even imagine right now what the different personality traits that will arise for the different use cases will be. But as a starting point for AFA, we'll put together a collection of personality traits that map to the genome matrix. The community will be involved in deciding where they end up on that genome matrix. And some of those personality traits might not necessarily benefit from a high number. For instance, clumsiness. You probably don't want a 9 in clumsiness. But overall, the genome matrix, higher numbers generally mean better for things like strength and speed and agility and perception. But there will be ones where that's not necessarily the case. I think it's important that it is through community participation on where those mappings end up on the genome matrix. The mechanism for doing that hasn't been released yet, and we have a few options with different levels of participation that we'll put out to the community. But I think one thing I know for sure is that Altered State Machine can't be the ones deciding where those mappings end up.
On an environment by environment basis, how will the interpretation be decided?
So the aim is to keep consistency between execution environments. So if there is a strength stat in AFA, for example, and a power stat in another environment, you could imagine those two things should be very closely related to each other on the genome matrix. And the tag cloud of attribute mappings is going to be important for developers when they're designing these games and experiences. Where that starts off in the first place is an important thing for us to have community participation on. So we're not defining where that anchor point is for all those stats on the genome matrix, and it's there and designed to prevent any kind of front running from people purposely mapping certain attributes to certain areas in favor of their own brains. So if we get a democratized vote on where that starts, then it's fair for everybody who's participating.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Do you envision that eventually this is something that becomes under the purview of the DAO?
I think it's ultimately up to the developers to decide whether they want to keep consistency. And just to clarify, by developer, I mean not necessarily ASM developers, but third-party developers and partnerships who will be developing execution environments for the Altered State Machine platform. You can imagine a use case where a developer wants to say, actually, I'm going to flip everything on its head. So if you're used to having a fast character, he's suddenly slow. And that's, of course, up to them to decide whether they map it in that way or not. But the tag cloud is there of attributes mappings, and where every game and use case comes in and takes those mappings for to enable them to make decisions about whether they want to be consistent or not. But we don't want to restrict creativity to a point where people can't make their own decisions for their own execution environments if it makes sense for them. And ultimately, the community will decide whether that's a valuable way of doing it by participating in their execution environment or not.
One question that came through from the most recent Medium article was about genome mining. And the question is asking if Gen 2 brains are guaranteed by participation in genome mining, or if it's probabilistic distribution.
Yeah, because of the nature of tokens, it has to be probabilistic. And a good example of why that is if you put in one ASTO token, you can't be guaranteed to get one brain at the same rate as somebody who puts in 1 million ASTO tokens. So it has to scale up with the amount of participation with ASTO that you put in there.
So a common question from the community is around the possible overlap between genome mining and the ASTO Discovery Auction. As the community evaluates their options for participation in the auction, they are wondering about the possible overlap of genome mining and the lockup period for the LP tokens.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a few things that we can do, and we've actually gotten some really good suggestions from the community on this. And the team's been evaluating those options over the past 24 hours. One of those options is to allow LP tokens to participate in the genome mining event, which makes the choice easier from a participation in the LBA standpoint, where you can both get the rewards from the LBA and also participate in genome mining at the same or a similar level as anybody who held on to their tokens. So the team's evaluated that option, and we've come to the conclusion that at the end of the 3-month lockup period, you can allow LP tokens to stake in genome mining event. And if you use LP tokens to do that, you can get a boost to your yield farming of brains to make it a much easier decision to participate in the LBA.
So participants in the discovery auction might be able to hit the rewards from both. They can get the LP rewards from the ASTO Discovery Auction, and they can participate in genome mining with a possible multiplier. It is no longer a mutually exclusive decision.
Yeah, kind of have your cake and eat it too. There's some good reasons why we need to get utility onto the platform as soon as possible, and genome mining is that first set of utility. But also people want to participate as much as they can in the protocol and everything that we're releasing, which is really encouraging sign. So if we can find a way to make both of those things possible, that's what we're going to do.
So everyone who participates in the ASTO Discovery Auction will get LP tokens that hold both USDC and ASTO, correct?
That's right. At the end of the 3 months, you'll be getting back LP tokens that will represent both ASTO and USDC.
So it sounds like at the most basic level, LP tokens are total value of the liquidity pool over the circulating supply of the LP tokens.
That's exactly it. So let's imagine a scenario where the auction ends and there's 10 ASTO on the ASTO side of the pool and there's 10 USDC on the USDC side of the pool. So in other words, the final ratio is 1 ASTO for 1 USDC. Now let's fast forward 3 months. Let's imagine that since this time, the ratio of ASTO and USDC, or the price of ASTO and USDC, has remained unchanged. So in other words, within the Uniswap pool, ASTO is trading at 1 USDC. So at this time, somebody who deposited 1 USDC, that person would own 10% of the liquidity pool, and they'd be able to redeem their LP tokens for 0.5 ASTO and 0.5 USDC. In fact, it would be even better than this because you'd also be accumulating a share of the Uniswap fees during this time. So in fact, you would receive a little bit more than 0.5 ASTO and a little bit more than 0.5 USDC. But actually, that's not it, because you'd also be getting the rewards that we're providing to all participants in the liquidity bootstrap auction. So as you'll recall, we've set aside 1% of all ASTO as rewards for those who participate in the liquidity bootstrap auction. And in particular, 25% of that is going to go towards USDC depositors. So if you deposited 1 USDC and you earn 10% of the USDC pool, you are going to receive back 10% of that 25% of ASTO rewards, which will equate to 0.025% of all ASTO, which is a pretty large number.
It sounds like people need to be thinking 3 months in the future. They need to be thinking, what do I think the price of ASTO will be in 3 months?
One of the key design decisions here was to have a lockup of 3 months for the LP tokens. And the reason we did that is because we want to incentivize everyone to have at least a 3-month time horizon when they consider the price of the token. So LP tokens represent your share of something called a liquidity pool. Liquidity pools enable the trading of tokens, and they're often used in automated market makers. And 2 examples of those would be Uniswap and SushiSwap. Your LP tokens essentially give you a claim on the liquidity that has been added to the different pools in these protocols. So if you own 50% of the liquidity provider LP tokens, that means that you own 50% of those pools and can redeem the value from those pools in return for your LP tokens.
If I were to deposit 1,000 ASTO into the ASTO Discovery Auction, at the end of the 3 months, am I getting 1,000 ASTO back?
So the short answer is no. What you'll be receiving back at the end of the 3 months is a share of LP tokens. So let me walk you through exactly how this works. At the end of the 1-week auction, we're going to take all of the ASTO and all of the USDC that has been deposited by everyone. We're then going to deposit that into Uniswap, and Uniswap is going to provide back LP tokens that represent everything we've deposited. So at the end of the 3 months, you'll receive a portion of those LP tokens depending on how much you've committed to the pools. So in particular, 50% of the LP tokens will be going to people who have deposited to the ASTO pool, and the other 50% of LP tokens will be going to those who have committed to the USDC pool. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that you own 10% of the ASTO pool. You've put in 10% of all ASTO in the ASTO pool. That means that you'll be receiving back 10% of the 50% of LP tokens. In other words, you'll be receiving back 5% of all LP tokens. And what exactly can you do with these LP tokens? Well, at the end of the 3 months, you'd be able to withdraw those LP tokens from Uniswap, and you would receive back both ASTO and USDC, which represent the share of those tokens in the liquidity pool at that time.
John, in a scenario where there were 10 ASTO and 10 USDC put into the discovery auction, an individual who had put in 2 ASTO, what would they be getting back? Let's talk through some of the scenarios that might happen at the end of the 3 months for that individual, depending on the price action of ASTO.
Let's walk through that scenario. So in that scenario, you've put in 2 ASTO, and in total, there's 10 ASTO that have been put into that side of the pool. So in other words, you own 20% of the ASTO pool. Now, 50% of all the LP tokens are going to go towards that ASTO pool. So if you multiply the 50% of LP tokens for the ASTO, multiplied by the 20% that you own, that comes out to a total of 10%. So you will receive back 10% of all LP tokens that we have received when we deposited all the funds into Uniswap. Okay, so essentially there are 3 different scenarios here. Number 1, at the end of the 3 months, the price is exactly the same as when the auction finished. Scenario number 2, the price is higher than when the auction finished. And scenario number 3, the price is lower than when the auction finished. And each of these 3 different scenarios will result in you being able to claim different ratios of ASTO and USDC from those LP tokens. And let's discuss directionally what that impact would be. So if the price has gone up, this means that more USDC liquidity is in the pools, which means if you were to claim ASTO and USDC from your LP tokens, you would receive back relatively more USDC and relatively less ASTO. So that's the scenario if the price goes up. Now, if the price goes down, that means that there's relatively more ASTO in the pool and relatively less USDC in the pool, which means that at the end of those 3 months, your LP tokens would now result in you being able to claim relatively more ASTO and less USDC. And if the price is the same, then the LP tokens will be redeemable for ASTO and USDC in the same ratio as when the auction closed. We'd encourage everyone to study the details of impermanent loss and to read up on automated market makers, because that's going to contain the key material you need to understand the different scenarios here.
Another question is around the allocations of tokens for founders and early contributors. What tools are in place for the community to track those allocations and see the schedules that they will be released on?
Yeah, actually all the vesting schedules are visible on the Hal and DAO, and it's important to have that level of transparency available for how these things are being distributed. So every ASTO token is accounted for in those vesting schedules, and you can see what the time periods are and things like lockup periods for the different contributors and people receiving ASTO token. So those vesting schedules are also detailed in the white paper if you want to go and have a look and see what they are and how they play out over time. One of the things that we're doing with the founders tokens is they actually are going into the Alter State Machine company treasury to be locked up indefinitely. We don't actually have a need to use those tokens anytime soon. They will be at the discretion of the board to decide what to do with them. This prevents individuals who might be receiving those tokens from going and, selling them to buy a yacht, for example. As for the early contributors, they are subject to vesting schedules as well, which slowly release the tokens over a period of time, which is a mechanism typically employed to ensure that a large supply of tokens are not dumped on the market at any one point. The investors that we've brought on board and early contributors that were brought on board are dedicated to the project long term. specifically chosen for that reason and very well incentivized to make sure that the longevity of the project is kept intact.
So it sounds like ASM is being transparent in its allocation and distribution of the ASTO token by running everything through a smart contract that anyone in the world could verify and evaluate.
Yes, and I think that's the way it has to be done in Web3. This is definitely the standard, and we couldn't be claiming that we were decentralized and open and transparent without doing it that way.